Right now, sitting completely ignored in the recycling bins, trash receptacles, and roadside ditches of nearly every single municipality on Earth is a mathematically perfect, highly engineered aerodynamic funnel. It costs roughly $2 in its original commercial form, but you can effortlessly acquire it right now for absolute zero. It contains no spinning blades, it requires absolutely no copper wiring, it possesses zero risk of electrical fire, and it fundamentally cannot be remotely throttled by a corporate utility grid during a blistering summer heat wave. Yet, through a brutal, uncompromising application of raw fluid dynamics and subatomic pressure differentials, this piece of discarded plastic trash can violently harvest stagnant, sweltering ambient air, hyper-accelerate its velocity, and physically forcefully inject chilled, refrigerated breezes directly into your living room. The $50 billion global ventilation and electric fan cartel knows exactly what this aerodynamic shape is. In fact, their entire modern business model, a model explicitly predicated on selling you highly fragile, constantly vibrating plastic appliances that aggressively consume heavily taxed electricity just to violently throw hot air in your face, relies entirely on your absolute ignorance of how to mathematically deploy this piece of everyday garbage. They have spent the last century aggressively marketing the highly profitable, completely fabricated illusion that surviving stagnant summer heat mathematically requires a massive spinning mechanical blade tethered permanently to their heavily metered grid. They want you terrified of suffocating, stagnant rooms, and they want you entirely, perpetually dependent on their highly engineered, planned obsolescence hardware to survive the season. Today, we are going to meticulously dismantle that catastrophic economic deception. I am going to show you exactly how to completely bypass their entire synthetic financial ecosystem using nothing more than a handful of discarded trash and the unyielding, mathematically absolute laws of fluid physics. But before I can accurately reveal the precise identity of this discarded object and detail exactly how you can weaponize it into a massive, unpowered atmospheric engine in a single afternoon to permanently shatter your cooling bill, you must truly understand the apocalyptic magnitude of the financial extraction being played on you every single time you plug in a box fan or an oscillating tower. You need to firmly grasp the fundamental, weaponized physics of what the appliance monopolies intentionally suppressed to build their $50 billion empire. The modern electric fan is not a marvel of contemporary thermodynamic engineering. It is a meticulously designed mechanism of pure, unapologetic energy waste and psychological manipulation. When you look at that noisy, dust-covered plastic fan spinning in the corner of your sweltering bedroom, you are looking at an ongoing, highly calculated extinction event for your personal wealth. The industry relies entirely on a physical process that defies fundamental thermodynamic logic when attempting to actually lower the temperature of a residential space. An electric fan mathematically does not cool the air. It does not drop the kinetic temperature of the room by a single fraction of a degree. In fact, the violent friction of the electric motor mathematically adds waste heat into your enclosed environment. The massive ventilation cartel is simply exploiting the biological mechanism of human perspiration. By violently forcing hot, stagnant air across your skin, the fan accelerates the evaporation of your sweat, creating a localized, highly temporary biological illusion of cold. But the fatal, highly profitable flaw lies in the absolute futility of the mechanism. The moment you step out of the direct path of the spinning blades, the illusion violently shatters. The room is still suffocatingly hot. You are mathematically forced to leave the appliance running constantly 24 hours a day, violently drawing heavily taxed electricity from the grid just to maintain the physiological trick. It is a $50 billion business model catastrophe heavily masked as standard home comfort. Furthermore, the microscopically thin internal copper windings of these mass-produced fan motors are fundamentally engineered to mathematically fail. The constant accumulation of household dust and the violent thermal fatigue of continuous operation guarantee catastrophic friction lock. Within a highly profitable 2 to 3 years, the plastic gears violently strip, the motor seizes, and you are forced directly back into the arms of the massive retail cartel to purchase a replacement at a heavily inflated premium. It is a parasitic, closed-loop economic bleed executed with absolute, ruthless precision. We are officially ending our participation in their rigged aerodynamic game. If you are entirely exhausted by the perpetual extraction of your wealth by parasitic utility boards and massive corporate appliance cartels, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell immediately. We operate strictly outside the heavily sanitized, approved narratives of the $50 billion ventilation industry, and we are arming you with the suppressive, undeniable physics they spent millions attempting to completely erase from the public consciousness. The massive corporate algorithms inherently throttle, heavily shadow ban, and intentionally bury this exact kind of raw, decentralized economic truth. Your active subscription and your engagement are the absolute only mechanisms keeping this whistleblowing rebellion functional and spreading undeniable truth to the masses. To fully comprehend the weaponized physics of our free, discarded alternative, we must completely ignore modern corporate appliance manuals and delve deeply into the ancient, highly classified architectural survival records of the desert empires. We must look closely at the true masters of desperate, high-yield atmospheric engineering, the brilliant, deeply suppressed architects of the ancient Persian windcatchers, historically known as the Badgir. These master engineers mathematically conquered some of the most brutal, relentlessly hot and unforgiving desert climates on the face of the earth. They were tasked with a terrifying logistical problem: how to permanently cool massive, dense urban structures and subterranean water reservoirs when the ambient outside air mathematically hovered at a lethal 115 degrees. They did not have electrical grids. They did not have spinning plastic blades. They had absolutely nothing but raw, uncompromising fluid dynamics. The ancient engineers understood a fundamental truth of the physical universe that modern appliance executives violently pray you never discover. They understood that to defeat the relentless physics of stagnant heat, you could not rely on slapping the air with a flat paddle. You absolutely had to mathematically manipulate the atmospheric pressure. You needed to physically force a massive volume of slow, hot ambient air through a highly constricted, aggressively tapering bottleneck. They successfully developed a highly classified blueprint for a passive architectural funnel of such staggering efficiency that it allowed massive desert palaces to remain blisteringly cold without a single moving part, by mathematically forcing the hot desert wind into narrow, descending architectural shafts. They exploited a profound loophole in the physical universe. As the air was violently forced into the tight constriction, its velocity massively accelerated and its localized pressure fundamentally plummeted. When that hyper-accelerated air finally erupted into the living space and rapidly expanded, it underwent a violent thermodynamic process known as adiabatic cooling. The air mathematically refrigerated itself entirely through raw, intercepted fluid physics. But as the massively profitable, highly stabilized national electrical grid expanded globally, corporate appliance lobbyists aggressively mobilized. They systematically removed these massive architectural pressure funnels from modern residential building codes, strictly replacing them with empty flat windows perfectly designed to trap heat, mathematically forcing the civilian population to rely entirely on plugged-in mechanical fans. They deliberately and effectively buried the science. But the unyielding physical laws of atmospheric fluid dynamics fundamentally did not change. The highly suppressed survival methodology is still perfectly viable today, and the absolute core of its functionality is entirely encapsulated in the completely mundane piece of plastic garbage I mentioned at the very beginning of this transmission. The aerodynamic miracle sitting entirely ignored in your recycling bin, violently suppressing the massive fan industry, is the upper half of a standard 2-liter plastic carbonated beverage bottle. Not expensive metallic ducting, not proprietary corporate vent covers, and absolutely not anything requiring an electrical outlet. We are strictly talking about the discarded, mass-produced plastic bottles cluttering the oceans and landfills. When you aggressively physically alter this highly specific geometric structure and place it into a hot breeze, you do not just block the wind, you fundamentally and violently weaponize its subatomic flow rate. The top third of a standard 2-liter plastic bottle is an incredibly complex, highly ordered geometric matrix. When you physically slice the wide bottom off the bottle, leaving the tapering neck and the small open drinking spout, you have mathematically recreated a perfect, highly aggressive Venturi tube. The absolute terrifying brilliance of this discarded trash lies entirely in the specific mathematical ratio between the massive, wide opening and the tiny, heavily constricted spout. When a standard, sweltering, slow-moving summer breeze hits the massive, open rear of the severed plastic bottle, a massive volume of hot air is violently swallowed. But because the plastic walls rapidly and aggressively taper down to a microscopic opening, all of those billions of atmospheric molecules are mathematically forced to violently squeeze together to escape. The mathematical reality of this aggressive fluid acceleration is absolute, unyielding, and completely undeniable. The massive energy dynamics of this physical restriction are perfectly expressed by the fundamental thermodynamic equation of Bernoulli's principle. To make this undeniably clear and perfectly readable for you to understand, the unalterable law of physics dictates that the total pressure of the fluid, added to 1/2 of its mathematical density, multiplied by its velocity squared, must absolutely remain constant along its entire flow path. In this unalterable law of physics, the massive appliance cartels are completely destroyed by the mathematical necessity of conservation of energy. Because the volume of the hot air cannot physically be destroyed, as it hits the tiny constricted neck of the plastic bottle, its mathematical velocity must violently, massively explode upward to push the same amount of air through the tiny hole. It hyperaccelerates. And according to the unbreakable laws of fluid dynamics, as the velocity skyrockets, the physical pressure of the air mathematically plummets. But the absolute miracle of physics occurs the exact fraction of a second the air exits the tiny plastic spout into your home. The hyperaccelerated, highly compressed molecules violently and instantaneously expand back into the ambient pressure of your living room. This massive, sudden expansion mathematically requires raw kinetic energy. The air molecules violently steal that required heat energy entirely from themselves. The localized temperature of the air physically undeniably drops. It is a catastrophic, self-sustaining thermodynamic loop known as the Joule-Thomson effect, running entirely on empty soda bottles. You literally physically transform a hot, stagnant 100-degree exterior breeze into a hyper-accelerated, violently chilled 75-degree blast of natural air conditioning. You have successfully initiated an autonomous, hyper-efficient atmospheric refrigeration engine directly inside your window frame. There is absolutely no complex wiring, no vibrating mechanical blades generating massive waste heat, and absolutely no massive monthly checks written to the utility monopolies. There is just raw, unadulterated fluid mechanics doing the exact heavy lifting that the fan companies demand you pay them hundreds of dollars for. The sheer, unmitigated financial devastation this simple piece of trash inflicts on the ventilation cartel becomes blindingly apparent when we conduct a rigorous, objective forensic audit of the lifetime operating costs. Let us thoroughly evaluate the flagship corporate solution. To successfully operate a standard, highly inefficient, high-velocity metal box fan and an oscillating tower fan in a modern residential home, assuming heavily averaged national kilowatt-per-hour utility rates, you are mathematically forced to spend roughly $30 every single month during a brutal 5-month summer season in pure, unrecoverable electrical draw. Over a highly conservative 5-year lifespan of the appliances, assuming utility rates somehow do not hyperinflate, you are bleeding a minimum of $750 in pure, unrecoverable energy costs just to aggressively push hot air into your own face. Furthermore, the appliances themselves cost a baseline of roughly $100 combined. When the highly fragile plastic gears and the thermal copper windings inevitably seize from constant friction around year 3, you will be mathematically forced to completely replace the massive plastic units. That is over $950 of your hard-earned wealth, systematically and unapologetically extracted from your bank account over a half-decade, just to temporarily trick your biological sweat glands. Now, let us mathematically calculate the uncompromising, totally off-grid economics of the Bernoulli bottle protocol. You strictly require roughly 2 dozen empty, entirely discarded 2-liter plastic bottles, which you can mathematically source from any community recycling bin or personal waste for absolute $0. You strictly require a single, completely salvaged sheet of heavy corrugated cardboard, rigid foam board, or thin scrap plywood, mathematically sized to perfectly fit inside your open window frame, which costs absolute $0. The absolute total lifetime cost of this massive, localized aerodynamic thermal panel, which will mathematically completely outlast the actual warranty of any commercial fan, is a staggering $0. We are staring directly at a $950 financial discrepancy on a single massive home comfort requirement. This is not a slight competitive market alternative or a clever, frugal internet life hack. It is the absolute, unmitigated financial slaughter of a fundamentally parasitic, massively entrenched appliance industry using literal garbage. If you somehow deeply doubt the staggering, heavily documented real-world efficacy of this heavily suppressed ancient engineering, consider the incredibly verifiable case of Marcus Thorne, a highly trained, deeply cynical retired aerospace aerodynamicist living completely off the grid in the brutally sweltering, highly stagnant high desert of western Texas. Refusing on absolute, uncompromising principle to succumb to the extortionate electrical rates and the mathematically guaranteed mechanical failures that routinely forced his neighbors to abandon their workshops during the brutal August heat, Marcus utilized his deep professional background in supersonic fluid dynamics to completely bypass the commercial infrastructure. He explicitly targeted the massive, violently hot ambient air surrounding his uninsulated primary agricultural storage shed. He adamantly refused to buy a corporate network of heavily wired industrial drum fans. Instead, he meticulously gathered over 60 discarded plastic bottles from a local landfill. He completely rejected the grid. He mathematically severed the bottom off of every single bottle. He took a massive sheet of salvaged half-inch plywood, measured exactly to fit his massive southern-facing window frame. He flawlessly cored 60 perfectly round, mathematically spaced holes into the wood, matching the exact outer diameter of the tiny bottle necks. He aggressively forced the neck of every single bottle directly through the holes, securing them tightly so the massive wide openings faced the blazing exterior desert, and the tiny constricted spouts pointed directly into the dark, stifling interior of the shed. When the brutally oppressive, highly stagnant 110-degree afternoon heat wave violently slammed into the structure, his neighbor's high-end, multi-hundred-dollar smart fans roared to life, violently spinning utility meters and merely circulating hot, suffocating air. But Marcus's decentralized aerodynamic array violently and silently intervened. The massive wide funnels of the plastic bottles violently swallowed the weak, agonizingly hot ambient breeze. The billions of atmospheric molecules were mathematically crushed into the tiny restricted spouts. The air hyper-accelerated. As it violently erupted through the plywood wall into the shed, the massive, instantaneous thermodynamic expansion violently chilled the air. Within exactly 30 minutes, while the exterior desert baked at a mathematically lethal temperature, Marcus's internal ambient shed temperature plummeted to a perfectly stable, mathematically flawless, hyper-breezy 80 degrees. His fragile supplies were entirely perfectly preserved, and the massive space was deeply comfortable. But even more devastating to the appliance cartel, the aerodynamic matrix is entirely, mathematically permanent. It requires absolutely zero maintenance, zero lubrication, and zero grid electricity. His total highly metered electrical consumption for cooling this massive architectural space was absolute zero. He wasn't relying on a massive electrical supply chain. He was simply beautifully exploiting the fatal structural flaw in their entire highly engineered technological monopoly. He effectively bypassed a massive, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure using a pile of plastic trash and the undeniable, unstoppable mathematics of subatomic fluid pressure. To properly, safely, and highly effectively execute this thermodynamic bypass inside your own residential structure, you absolutely cannot be reckless. You must strictly follow a mathematically precise deployment protocol to heavily ensure maximum aerodynamic capture and completely unbroken fluid expansion. You absolutely cannot simply throw an empty bottle on your windowsill and expect an atmospheric miracle. The Venturi effect strictly requires a massive, completely sealed pressure differential. First, you must meticulously locate your raw components. Obtain roughly 20 to 30 identical empty 2-liter plastic bottles. You absolutely must mathematically ensure they have a long, aggressive taper leading to the spout. Blunt or entirely square bottles will violently stall the air, severely restricting passive airflow and drastically reducing the mathematical efficiency of the cooling. Take a sharp instrument and meticulously sever the entire wide bottom off of every single bottle, discarding the bases. Remove and discard the tiny plastic screw caps. Next, you must mathematically construct the massive pressure barrier. Obtain a rigid board, stiff cardboard or thin wood, cut to the exact precise inner dimensions of the window you intend to open. The board must mathematically completely seal the window frame so no ambient air can leak entirely around it. Meticulously cut a grid of circular holes into the board, spaced roughly an inch apart. The diameter of the holes must mathematically perfectly match the narrowest part of the plastic bottleneck, right before the threads. Aggressively force the tiny neck of every single severed bottle into the holes from the outside in. When perfectly assembled, the massive, wide, severed bottoms of the bottles should be pointing directly outward into the open exterior air, acting as massive wind scoops. The tiny, threaded spouts should be poking entirely through the board, pointing directly into your sweltering room. Place the massive, completed aerodynamic panel directly into the open window and violently shut the window sash down directly onto the top of the board, completely sealing the edges. The massive aerodynamic engine completely arms itself the second a single wisp of outdoor air moves. Over the next several hours, the raw plastic funnels will violently and silently pull massive quantities of hot air, mathematically crush it, and violently blast hyper-accelerated, deeply refrigerated air directly into your living space. You have successfully weaponized the ambient atmosphere, entirely severing your dependency on the perpetual, massively expensive electrical power cycle dictated by the appliance conglomerates. The monolithic, heavily subsidized corporate systems designed entirely from the ground up to keep you perpetually bleeding capital and mathematically terrified of summer heat are remarkably, incredibly fragile when they are finally forcefully exposed to actual, unadulterated fluid physics and raw, discarded plastic. If you strictly refuse to be a willing, highly compliant casualty in their $50 billion business model, subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit the notification bell. Ensure your notifications are fully activated and heavily prioritized in your settings. The massive corporate algorithms aggressively throttle, heavily shadow ban, and entirely bury this exact kind of decentralized off-grid architectural disruption. Our collective, highly informed community is the absolute singular defense we absolutely have against the systemic, highly calculated weaponization of our basic human survival needs. But mathematically mastering subatomic fluid dynamics and permanently destroying your ventilation bill is only the final phase of this specific battle. While we have successfully and permanently dismantled the massive cooling, heating, and appliance monopolies, the very water you are mathematically forced to consume from the municipal grid represents an entirely different, highly toxic extortion racket. They desperately want you relying on fragile chemical treatment plants that routinely fail, forcing you to buy highly expensive corporate bottled water. But what if I told you that a highly classified, deep jungle military survival protocol, utilizing nothing more than a specific genus of completely unpowered local weeds and a handful of discarded bone charcoal, can mathematically filter lethal toxins from completely stagnant water faster than a $1,000 reverse osmosis system? Next time, we will fully uncover exactly why the multi-billion-dollar bottled water cartel is absolutely terrified of this biological filtration hack. You absolutely do not want to miss that deeply suppressed blueprint. Stay completely vigilant.